talking about symmetry today, but I wanted to take a little bit of a twist on that and focus on three things that I really love: brains, bias, and behavior. As Justin said, I'm a co-founder of a design studio here in Malmö. We're around almost 4 years old, so a little bit younger than CreativeMornings. That's us. And I'm a UX designer and a strategist. So I spend most of my time trying to figure out why people behave the way they do, why they use things the way they do, and what makes them tick. So that's me doing what I'm doing most of the days. When I'm not doing that, that's me too, looking into how behavior comes to be. And I recently started to look into neuroscience and things like that, and psychology, which really bolsters UX design, right? So I thought I'm going to give you a little bit of a rundown of the things that I find extremely interesting about that. And since the topic is symmetry, I picked a couple of facts that go around the symmetry of the human body and the human brain. The interesting thing about it is that maybe if you think about symmetry, the first thing that comes to mind is it's in math, it's a super important principle in nature. It comes up in, the sunflower, in leaves, in animals. We are attracted to symmetry. We are attracted to symmetrical faces. We like symmetrical patterns. Really asymmetrical patterns pull our attention, so they jump out at us. We use it as like visual guidelines to make sense of the world. But we actually also use very hidden symmetries to make sense of the world, things that we are not very aware of, that have nothing to do with a visual sense at all. And that is where the brain comes in. So I want to start by the physical buildup of the brain a little bit, and then walk over to the biases that we have, and then how that informs our behavior. And then I try to close the loop to go back how we can actually avoid some biases or work with that behavior in a design process. So I hope that sounds good to you. And I realized I only have 20 minutes. I always thought it's 30 minutes. So I'm gonna hurry up, but I'll just keep on talking. And if I jump over stuff, just please ask me afterwards. I promise I'll try to make it interesting. So, the human brain. When you look at it, it looks very symmetrical at first. We have two hemispheres, which are very important. We have different components that are laid out very symmetrical in the brain as well. But despite it being pretty symmetrical systemically, structurally, it's not at all functionally. So we use our hemispheres for very different things. We use the parts of the brain for very different things. And most importantly, it's always changing, it's always in flux. Depending on what we do, what we think, certain brain areas get used and utilized more, and therefore start up building stronger connections, so those things become easier, and we use it even more, so it's an ever ongoing circle, which in the end is learning. And very similar to our body, actually, which is also kind of symmetrical. We have two hands, we have 2 feet, but your right hand and your left hand are very different from each other in the sense of how you use it. That also has a big impact of the brain. Similarly structured, very different aspects when you utilize your left brain or your left brain side or your right brain side. And we also have like 2 main systems, kind of, like very broadly speaking in all of these things. We have the conscious system and the unconscious operating system. Very general, the conscious system sits here in the cerebral cortex, the big one, and the unconscious system sits here in the cerebellum, which is the more unconscious driver. But those two are very intrinsically connected, which leads to a very astonishing fact that most of the time we actually don't have a whole lot of insights into why we do what we do. We think we have very logical reasoning, but in the end we actually don't, because we don't really have access to whatever happens in the cerebellum from a very aware perspective. So if you have a fight with a friend and you think, geez, that friend is just completely horrible because that's what they did is wrong. That sounds very logical to you, but you might as well just have low blood sugar. And that informs your motivation. Very likely, actually. Because our brains are an ever-changing thing, they very much depend in their plasticity on what we do. So if we are exposed to certain experiences, they develop differently, which means all of us have very, very different brain patterns, actually. That means if one of us looks at a video and another person looks at a video and we observe the brain activity going on, they might look very different. So everybody has the same symmetrical arrangements, but everybody uses them very different, and the brain activity is very different sorted. Except for when you have friends and look at their brain patterns. That is something that's very interesting. The more you like another person, the more likely it is that your brain activity patterns are actually symmetrical when exposed to the same content. That is also true for family members, for example, or any other people that are close in your social network. That fact of liking each other and like connecting to each other also overrides things like race, age, gender, or other things, which are also close indicators to having maybe somewhat similar brain structures because you might have similar experiences. But more important than those external criteria are actually your opinions and your preferences in kind of defining what kind of activity you show. And that is also very interesting in the sense of that somebody who has very opposed views to you might actually have a very different physical brain. So if you can't understand why there are some people who vote for Trump, that is because they have a fundamentally different brain. You are actually physiological different. I find that sometimes soothing. One thing that also comes from that is that given that brain patterns might be similar, you're actually far more likely to understand intention of people that you like, which means there are less misunderstandings, and you can utilize something that is called mirror neurons far more. Most of you might have heard of mirror neurons. Mirror neurons are neurons that start activating when you watch somebody doing something. So basically your brain shows a very similar activity to somebody else who is doing something, even though you're just watching them. But what you take away from that area of activity is then the neurons that are actually performing that said action. So you have like a passive recording of what somebody else is doing in your brain. That is much stronger when you can actually understand the targeted behavior. So if it's just a random sequence of movement that you watch somebody do, those mirror neurons won't activate. But if you realize that person is actually dancing, those mirror neurons might get active far more. So you get a far stronger symmetry between your brain activation patterns. Okay, that was like the general rundown on how brain activities relate. How does that influence our behavior? Those brain activity signals make up what we generally understand as emotions. And those emotions are the drivers for our behavior. Emotions are, in neuroscience, kind of defined as a symmetrical composite of feelings, expressive behavior, and physiological changes. The interesting part of that is that most people simulate emotions with feelings, which is not actually true. An emotion of fear consists of the feeling that your hormones trigger, together with the physiological change of your heart beating faster or your skin becoming a little bit more sweaty, together with the physiological change in your, of expressive behavior in your face, for example, showing fear, widening your eyes. And you might think that the feeling is the first thing that happens. Like, you're scared, and therefore your heart starts to race. But actually that's not really the case. You might just as well get a higher racing heart and therefore become scared. So your body starts to really listen in on all three of them and makes up the emotion from that. Which is also why people try to, calm their heart when they try to calm themselves, or why when we smile more we become happier. our emotions definitely like listen to what our body is doing. The interesting part of that is that when you change the connection, when you impact the connection between the brain and the prefrontal cortex, which is in front there. You don't need to remember where it is, just that it exists. Those interpretations of physiological changes are impacted, and thereby our emotions change. For example, that a lesion in the prefrontal cortex leads to way more risky behavior because the body is actually not aware that you're showing physiological changes that indicate fear. So you might just not react as strongly. That very much defines your decisions and your behavior. And that area, the prefrontal cortex, is also where our brain calculates something that is called the, wait for it, common currency signal, which the brain uses to calculate how we value different options. The thing about that is that it's kind of a black box. Like, we're faced with so many different decisions every day and very different options, and how we value those different options very much varies based on our experience and our past and our education and so on. So the body kind of runs through a very abstracting pattern of like, okay, I take all those somatic information and I take all that experience and I do some math and I assign it this random value. Like, not very random, but this value. In order to just be able to compare very, very different things. And in order to do that, it kind of uses heuristics and kind of shortcuts to assign these values, basically. So it's like, yeah, a mathematical black box in our brain that makes decisions. And that is where biases come in. Because we don't actually know how we make decisions, and sometimes they're really, really illogical, how some people who study economics might know. Because that is one of the big patterns and paradigms being studied in economical behavior. How do we decide to buy something, spend money, and so on? And there are a whole lot of things that we can tap into to convince people or to tweak that decision mechanism to actually convince people to do something that might seem very irrational or illogical from the outside, but to that black box in the prefrontal cortex, it makes total sense. Cognitive biases. They're a systemic pattern of deviation from norm or rationality in judgment. There is not really a whole lot of consensus about how many biases there exist. Some psychologists define 25. Wikipedia has a list of 105. So some are like very overlapping, very similar. Most of them are very interesting. Anyway, and in general, they just are used to make up for situations where we don't have enough information. For example, we need to decide fast, so we take shortcuts. We don't have enough information, so we take shortcuts. We want to feel good about ourselves, so we take shortcuts. Or we just want to know where to go. Kind of like we need direction. Those are like the 4 big categories. But since we can't really walk through, or I don't want to walk through all of them because I only have 20 minutes, I picked some that I find the most interesting and that I find also maybe the most impactful in some senses. Biases that serve the perception of the symmetry of person, and biases that serve the perception of symmetry of good happening in the world. Both of those categories are something that we use regularly, and I will go through them on like certain layers. So first, on the micro level, if we just look at ourselves and those categories, in terms of wanting to just preserve the consistency of our own personality, there's something called the projection bias, which means we look back on our past self and edit memories in a way that our past impression from us is more similar to how we are now. So we eradicate change. And we also do that in the future. We expect ourselves to be very similar to how we are right now in the future and don't really account for the fact that we might change. We just want to stay the same. I know nobody says that. Everybody says we want to, better ourselves. But in fact, we are actually not really able to plan for that at all. Symmetry of the good. That is when we start to look at our decisions and behavior from the past and start justifying them why they weren't actually so bad. That might also very much modulate memories or justify things that were actually not really good. But in order to feel good about ourselves, we say no, that was actually a good decision. Everything else could have gone way worse without any kind of foundation for that. Oh, sorry, I jumped one too much. Where am I? Sorry. Okay, if you go to the meso level, which is kind of where biases affect not just us and how we think about ourselves, but also how we interact with another person. We have in order to keep the consistency of a group, we have the in-group bias. So we prefer people who are similar to us to be in our group, and everybody who's outside of our group and not similar to us, we don't like them as much. So they will just, by default, get assigned a much lower value in our black box of decision making. In terms of wanting to preserve the good, there exists the halo bias, which is we see someone do something good, or we think this is great about a person, and we just extrapolate that on a whole lot of other things they're good at. This person is intelligent, so they're also better looking, they're probably also luckier, they're probably also better leaders in our perception. Same goes for when people are very attractive. We assume they're better leaders, they're more intelligent, they're more lucky, and blah, 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 and so on. And then on a macro level, that is when these biases do not just affect our perceptions of ourselves and our interactions with other people, but actually how we see the world and bigger society structures. In terms of preserving the consistency of person, that is an effect that's called the cheerleader effect, which is basically an extension of the in-group bias, which is that people who are in big groups seem to be more right and also more attractive, which is true. All of you look great today. When looking at symmetry of good, we expect the world to be just. So we even out injustices that we don't want to see, basically, and pull certain actions on a bigger scale up to a more morally okay level. And the other one is moral luck, where we assign basically higher moral standing to successful people or successful mechanisms. So somebody who's rich is probably also morally superior, which doesn't make any sense at all, but maybe explains a whole lot about the world right now. So these are some of my favorite logical fallacies. The really, really bad thing about biases is that we have a complete blind spot for them. We're not really able to see them in ourselves. We're very much able to see them in other people, but we can't detect them in our own behavior. We are basically, we fall under naive realism, which means we expect the world to be the way we see it. Our reality is the reality, and everybody else is confused, dumb, stupid, they don't have all the information, and so on. But also, even if we would be aware of a bias and things like, hey, we can go around it, we always overestimate our own power of self-discipline. We always think we have far more willpower in terms of restraining from following those biases than we actually do. So what can we do about that? And that is where I'm going to close up again, kind of slowly, to how we can actually maybe integrate that kind of knowledge. What you see, well, kind of see, because it's pretty bright, is a blind audition at an orchestra. So in the 80s, they realized that most of the musicians in orchestras are male. and there are like only 10% female players. And they thought, that can't be right. But everybody who listened to the audition was like, yeah, but the guys are just better. So they started putting up those screens, and people started to audition behind the screens. And by now, we actually have a very equal amount of male and female players. So once you remove that factor that actually influences you, you're much more likely to be able to make solid decisions. But this way, this setup, does not even try to change the behavior. It doesn't try to change the thinking. It just removes the factor that influences our thinking. And that is the most important part. If we expect by ourselves to be better people, we are doomed to fail just by behavior. What we can do is adapt our environment and our tools and our processes to actually account for that, so that we don't have to be better thinkers. So now I would actually like to do an experiment. So I would need a volunteer, and I really hope this goes well. I have no idea if this is going to work. But who's brave and wants to try something out? Come on, don't be shy. Yes, okay, great. Come up front. So now let's see, let's hope this works.
Just curious.
Yeah, good. Okay. Yes, sure. What's your name?
Pablo.
Nice to help you. Nice of you to help out. Okay. So this is a number sequence, as you might have seen before, a number sequencing test, right? And I would like you to tell me what the next number is, but like not just what the next number is, but what the rule is, like which number would be okay in this sequence, basically, which next numbers. You can suggest as many numbers as you want. Like you can ask me, does this number work? Does this number work? And I'll say yes or no. You can check for as many as you want, and then when you're sure, you say what the rule is.
Okay.
Okay?
Yeah.
Okay, go.
So the first thing that came in my mind was 2, 4, 6, 8, 10.
Oh, wait. Ask number by number. So you want to ask for 6?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes. Is the next one 8?
Yes.
And
Figure it out, you can ask the...
okay, so is it +2 all the time?
No.
Okay.
The only thing that you need to fulfill would be that the number is bigger.
Okay.
So this was not, but basically that was right, but this was not to show that you're a great mathematician. Thank you very much. That was it. This was actually to show what is called confirmation bias. He could have asked for, like, once he had an idea what the right thing is, he asked for other numbers that are confirming to that idea. And he didn't stumble about anything that did not work, so he expected it to be right. What you did not do, what nobody does, I've tried this like 5 times, 10 times with friends, I've totally failed the first time, is ask for numbers that would contradict that rule. Because in order to test an assumption, you should not only ask for what falls into that assumption, but also what contradicts your assumption. Because you need that to be wrong in order for your assumption to be right. So what would make sense here is to ask, what about 3? What about 7? I would still have said yes, which would have shown like, oh, my assumption is actually not true. What about 1? No. Ah, okay. You get the gist? Actually trying to prove yourself wrong is an extremely important factor in any kind of design process, or probably any kind of process really, any kind of work. But this is what we kind of work with when we work with clients or projects, users trying to come up with a good solution, a good project, how we can actually build processes to check ourselves for biases in between. So that what I just showed is a confirmation bias, so also includes testing the hypothesis of the things you expect to be wrong or bad and see how they perform. Another one that's on the front, that most of you might have heard of as well, the IKEA effect. You always like things more that you have built yourself. So if you come up with a great idea, put yourself into the shoes of what if somebody else had came up with that idea. Would you still like it this much? Ideally, have somebody else present that idea to you and mirror it back. Is it still so nice and shiny? Especially very important when you do any kind of like ideation or research, any kind of anchoring, like attention bias, framing bias, which means information that you hear first becomes very, very important. Intention that sticks out, asymmetry, grabs our attention, so attention that, things that stick out draw our attention and become very, very important. What we do a lot is collect that information and reframe it constantly. We put it in one table, and then we put it in another matrix, and then we put it back in another table, which is, first it's a user flow, then it's a narrative story, then it's a customer experience flow journey. You can ask my colleagues. I use a lot of tables just to mix it all up, to put it in very, very different contexts and perspectives and framings, and see if I switch this point or this part of information around, put it to another point, is it still this important? Because does it become actually even more important? Does something else come up that I overlooked? And then the shared information bias, which is also very important for creative work in a group, which is that information within that everybody knows in a group gets assigned more value and more attention. So we try to always make sure that everybody reads our tables, all of them, and is aware of all the information we have, so that nothing falls to the side because only one person was, or two people were involved in an ideation process or a research session or something. I'm not doing too bad. Okay, that's it. Summary. Our brain is structurally very symmetrical, but it's not functionally very symmetrical, if you want to take something away from here about brains. You want to take something away about friends. Friends have far more likely symmetrical brain activity patterns, and mirror neurons, which means similar activity in brains, is what makes us more social. Our decision-making is riddled by biases because of the small decision-making black box in our prefrontal cortex. And we can't do anything about biases, we all have them, and it's pretty much a pain to try to avoid them just by plain changing your behavior, but if you actually change your environment, you can minimize the effects they have. That's it. Thank you.